Good afternoon, this is Gary Kavanagh here on TRSI. I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Michael Dwyer. Michael, how have you been since last week?
I've been much the same as any other week in many ways.
Well, we have a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Some have said, Michael, about the show, that it is elitist, not designed for the public, has a near insurmountable barrier to entry, given the tendency to make heavy use of in-jokes, cultural references, and often forget to either explain what's happening or promise to link something which will explain what's happening and then failing to do so.
Okay.
So we've taken that, Michael, and we've decided to run with it. So from maybe not next week, but in the next period, this podcast will no longer be available to the public. It will move to only be available to paying Gript subscribers. There has been a long internal consideration of what we can do to provide more value to our subscribers, and the decision has been made to put us behind that paywall.
Does that mean fewer people will hear this?
Yes, but it's not all upside.
What's the downside?
Well, I'm sure we have some long-term listeners, friends and colleagues, who will not subscribe and will therefore lose access to this on a Sunday or Monday morning on a bank holiday. And those people, Michael, will live a lesser life because of it. So in that way, we're reducing the happiness in the world. Or if all the listeners are subscribers and now they feel they're getting more value, we could be increasing the value in the world. That's the problem with utilitarianism. The maths is always very difficult.
Well, I would say to those listeners who fall into that category that Gary has loads of money, and you should write to him and ask him to see if he'll get you a sub for Gript, or you could set up a GoFundMe, or we could launch maybe a small charity to set up a fund that people can apply to for a subscription to Gript. Or, I think this is a really good idea, the Vincent de Paul could consider this kind of an acute crisis problem and set up a dedicated fund that people can apply to get a subscription. You see, Gary, I'm all about solutions.
Just someone going into the Vincent de Paul and saying, I've lost access to a podcast which covers news in a way which aggravates and angers me, and without it, I'm just too calm.
Yeah, I think they respond well to that.
So before we get into the major kind of two topics I wanted to talk about, which are really what we've seen in England over the past while, the reaction to the riots they had over there, and the sort of sentences we're seeing being handed out to people who got, Michael, a bit stroppy on social media. Sometimes a bit racist. Mostly stroppy, though, to be fair to them. And also, in a kind of sense of excellent timing, last week we were talking about the threats to the Irish economy, and the Taoiseach's advisor has come out and said, by God, look at all these threats to the Irish economy. Joining the Irish Fiscal Council, but no one cares about them, so we're just really mentioning their name to be nice to them. God, what a depressing job that must be. It's just, we want you to come in and just scream into the void. Just scream into the void with all your heart for a year, and then, just see how it goes.
Well, we're talking here about the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, which was set up by the government, an act of tremendous good faith to show that they really cared about getting it right, and they're going to set up this independent group of financial experts and economists who are going to advise them. And they publish lovely reports, Gary. Really nice, and they have graphs and everything, and they have descriptions and predictions and suggestions of what they could do, and they're well written. They seem to make absolutely no difference whatsoever to the practical behaviour of the government, but I still think it's a good thing that they're there.
I like to imagine that when you join the council and you ask what you can do to make the government listen to you, they just say, just go into this room and stand in the corner, and once you've stood there for, a couple of minutes, we'll be in to see you, and then you walk in and the room is entirely circular.
Yeah.
I just like to imagine there's just a general sense of confusion of why are we here and why are we doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Confusion and maybe a slight amount of fear.
Be not afraid. That's what the scriptures tell us.
So before we go into that, just a quick kind of review of a few things, including, Michael, an opinion I think will be deeply unpopular and you're going to have to back out of rapidly.
Oh yeah? What's that?
Yeah. So there was an incident, which we won't go into it beyond a certain amount of detail, Michael, because it's going to, it involves a minor and it's going to go to the court, so we don't need to do too much on it. But there was an instance in which an army chaplain was stabbed several times by a young person who seemed very, from the initial reports, very motivated and to have very passionate views on Irish military forces in Mali, which is one of those wonderful things where someone mentions it to you and you sort of go, what were we doing in Mali? When were we in Mali? Where is Mali on a map? Many questions.
All good questions.
Here's the thing. They were restrained. They're going to face trial for this. But here's my point, Michael. The soldiers fired 5 warning shots before taking batons out and basically, bringing this person to the ground. Sorry, it may have just been one. It may have just been the initial soldier. Some of the wording on this has been kind of inexact. Some have said soldiers, some have said a single sentry. But, and they were lauded for this. My view on this, Michael, is that at the point someone is actively stabbing another member of the military, you should just shoot them.
They shot some warning shots over the head of the assailant, I think, at the beginning. It's funny, I was having a conversation with a policeman about this subject, and he said that the army may have different rules of engagement, but he said that they would have been entitled to shoot him.
Well, the reporting on this, particularly in the Irish Times, said that the warning shots were in accordance with the protocols and the use of force in the military. And there just seems to be this sort of, oh, well, that's a bloody well good thing. Whereas I just generally, if someone is being stabbed and you're firing warning shots, you're giving that person more time to continue stabbing people. Just shoot them. I'm not saying, by the way, the soldier did anything wrong, at least in relation to the protocols. I'm saying the protocols should be revised so that if someone is in immediate danger to life, you can just kill them. Because, Michael, a gun is it's not designed for the purpose of warding people. At the point you feel the usage of a gun is appropriate, you have made a decision to kill someone, or that you are willing to kill someone. And all of this, like, oh, isn't this lovely, no one died. Someone should have died.
Well, someone should have died. My understanding is, in this particular case, from the reporting, that is, and the reporting is a little confused and a little unclear, because the situation may have been unclear and confused, Gary, is that if the man was actually assaulting the priest in question, then I would suggest that it was very probably the case that hitting him over the head with a truncheon was probably a more effective way of getting him off, because in a situation where people are struggling and you decide to shoot them, you may shoot the wrong person. And that will lead to all sorts of difficulties. Now, it has been said to me on different times when people say, well, why didn't they just shoot him in the leg? That people who work in the area are asked this, they look and they say, and have a heavy sigh and a shake of the head, because apparently if you're shooting somebody, you go for the biggest bit of them, which is usually sort of their torso or maybe the head. And the idea that people are going to be in a position to accurately be able to just take out. And he said, also, you don't know. You hit them in the leg, you hit them in the foot, and what happens if they keep going and then they kill somebody else? And then you go, oh, well, I didn't know that. If I'd known they were going to do that, I would have shot him in the head, but hey ho. So you take the shot to take them out, which is that's the brutal reality of the situation. Anyway, the good news is that the priest in hospital has made enough of recovery to be able to make a statement. He's not well, as it were, but he is doing better. And the young person in question, yeah, I asked people, I said, do you know why? And they said, no. And I said, radicalized online by ISIS, apparently, no, this is the basis of the reports, apparently, because of our presence in Mali. And the response was universally, are we in Mali? And I was tempted, very slightly tempted, not really, to go down with an atlas and a map and say to people, could you point at Mali for me, please?
I wonder if this is how Americans feel sometimes when there's a terror attack and someone says, well, it's because of your presence in wherever, and you just have that, are we there?
Are we there? Pause. Where is there?
On the point you're making about people saying to shoot different body parts, whether it's the leg or the head or whatever, there are many good practical reasons for why you go for the centre of mass. But I think the fundamental issue I have with it is that it's a misunderstanding of the hierarchy of force. Different weapons are designed for different things. Guns are designed to kill. At the point you are using a gun, it's a threat that you have determined a lethal response is appropriate. All of this stuff about warning shots or glancing shots or whatever people want you to do, some of which are frankly in general situation practically impossible to do, I think just misunderstand it. If there is an active threat to human life, I think you're justified to use lethal force. And someone hanging off the side of a car, stabbing one of your colleagues several times, probably meets that bar.
Oh yeah, I'd say so.
But then again, Michael, I'm not known for my warmth and human empathy.
Not the warm and cuddlies. For those who are wondering why they might know Mali, Mali is the home to the great city of Timbuktu, which you will have heard of. As far as, however, it is not. And I want to correct this, Gary, because this is misinformation which is going out there. A lot of people are saying that Timbuktu is the capital of Mali. It is not. Bamako is the capital of Mali. And I think we should be very careful about our capitals because we need to know this kind of thing. And that kind of thing is going around, Gary, and it's not being corrected. And people are not saying what is right. And I won't stand for that.
Speaking of policies, Michael, that could perhaps do a little bit of changing.
Yeah.
Fatima Gunning reached out to the press office of An Garda Síochána there over the week.
Oh, God.
With just a very simple question. And it was this.
Yeah.
In what circumstances are members of An Garda Síochána not forced to wear identifying markings, whether that is a name, whether that is a number on an epaulet, whether it is an identifying marking of some type?
Yes.
And they got back and they said there's no situations in which that can happen. They must always be wearing it. And we said, oh well, what about the public order unit? And they said, no, even the public order unit. And then we went, okay, what about all these photos and videos of members of An Garda Síochána and the public order unit not wearing any identifying markets while dealing with anti-migration protests or anti-asylum seeker protests? I'm not quite sure what way we want to actually refer to that as. It seems to depend site to site, but we all know what we're talking about. And the response was, we will not comment on third-party material. But if any member of the public feels that they have not been treated fairly, they should go through the formal complaints process. And then we asked you, Michael, what I thought would be the obvious question. How do you complain about a guard if that guard has no identifying markings on him?
Good question, yeah, fair.
To which I'm not sure if we got no response or if they simply just repeated, go through the formal complaint process. But it's just, as we were talking about, policies that might not actually do the public any benefit. I just wanted to bring that one up.
Do you remember, this is not something I should ask you in recording time, I suppose, but anyway, do you remember you were asking them for something about something, some information, and they said that they hadn't sent it because it wasn't ready, and that's why you had it. But when it was ready, they would send it. This was when they said to you about something else. It was in the same communication that they weren't the CSO and go and fucking do it yourself. Ask them.
Oh, yeah, I was asking them about hate crimes. And they put out this release on hate crimes. And I said, well, it doesn't say how many of these crimes there were more generally in the year, so I can't tell what percentage of the crimes committed were hate crimes. And several of them don't link up with the way crime data is analysed by the CSO. So could you tell me what this means? Like, you have this heading, the CSO has this heading. Are they the same? And yeah, it was basically go ask the CSO. We wouldn't know that. And then I went to the CSO and they sort of went, well, it seems like the guards would be, the place to ask that, considering they pull all these statistics together. And you have to go, yes, well, they don't want to. So what have you got?
But there was something where they kept saying, it went on for months, that you said, well, when are you going to send? He said, you don't have it because it isn't ready. It will be sent when it's ready. And I don't think it was, I can't remember ever hearing that it was sent. So I'm just assuming it's not ready yet.
Oh, was that the one on drink spiking? that I first
yes,
put
it
in.
could be. Yeah. I think that was
I
it.
put that in October of 2023.
I think that...
Because if people remember, there was that massive panic about people using syringes
hypodermics
to spike people. And I was saying this is extremely unlikely for many, many practical reasons. But also, if people are drinking, they're already working on incapacitating themselves. Just buy them a drink. By far the most common sort of intervention in these cases. I think they eventually got back to me with something. Actually, sorry, maybe it wasn't October. It could have been May of 2023. I think they eventually got back to me with something that actually just didn't have any of the information I wanted at all.
Well, maybe could it possibly have been because there wasn't any people being stabbed with hypodermic syringes in nightclubs, so there wasn't really much to come back to you with?
No, it's like every now and then and actually I found out during the week, John does this as well, will send an email to them about, do you remember the Kitty Holland story about the migrant encampment in the woods?
Yes.
And I'll just say, so what's happening with that? Are you investigating? Have you found anything? And investigations are ongoing, Michael.
Yes.
Investigations are always ongoing.
Always ongoing, yes. Which is good to know.
I saw a wonderful story during the week. It was a Ken Fox story. It was on do you remember the tents that had been outside the IPO centre?
Yes.
It was on that. And it just had an incredible headline. And it was, staff at International Protection Office terrified they would be trapped if asylum seeker tents caught fire.
I'm sure it's just a phrasing and the manner of the headline, but it does make the staff of the IPO seem rather cold-hearted towards the fate of the poor bastards inside the burning tents, assuming they're inside them and haven't managed to flee. But also, I'm kind of aware where the IPO centre is, and I'm aware of the size of the tents, and I can't imagine that tents being out on fire on the pavement outside the IPO would actually present much of a danger to anybody except, as I say, the poor bastards perhaps inside the tent. Is there no back door to the IPO centre? That seems unlikely. The fire marshal wouldn't have come along and said, no, you have to have a fire escape and a back door in case the tents out front go on fire.
The terrified they would be trapped is a quote, and some of the other quotes in the article where they're talking about people dressing and undressing in front of the windows and how the tents were pressed up close to the windows.
Very upsetting.
Do make it sound as if the terrified they would be trapped is a sentence that doesn't end with, and therefore is a threat to everyone's life, but terrified they would be trapped with a terribly diminished view.
Or trapped for up to an hour.
It looks like there was they gathered feedback about the shanty town in a sort of, what should we do about this? Seeks feedback. And then it turned out staff really didn't like it at all. Turns out staff anywhere presumably would not like a shanty town on the side of their building, where they can see people getting dressed and undressed.
Well, you can imagine that. I mean, there is a piece of video which is available out there, which is genuinely comic. The tents, if the light is strong in the middle of the day, the tents, they are not transparent, but they are translucent. So you can see, shall we say, like a shadow show, like those Indian shadow puppets. And sometimes people get very friendly inside these tents. And there's one which is right in the middle of the day, and you can see these people walking by, and the reaction is kind of funny. Now, if you're working in an office and you're sitting there at your desk and there's a window beside you and people are going about their lives inside a tent in this manner, I can imagine after a while it would stop being funny, if it was ever funny to you, and became a bit of, oh, for God's sake. Leaving aside, Gary, shall we say, the more difficult and abstruse question, why the fuck are there tents in the middle of Dublin anyway?
Well, I mean, that was the sort of thing I thought as I was reading through Fox's piece on this. There's all this, this makes me feel this way, this makes me feel this way, as opposed to these just shouldn't be here, and we don't need to have a deep introspective moment about how this all makes us all feel. just send in the police and clean it up. Like, San Francisco, when there's a Chinese delegate, just round up all the homeless.
Yeah. Paris for the Olympics. For pretty well everywhere and anywhere when you have a large number of foreigners expected. You clean the gaff up.
So on to actually one of the stories I particularly wanted to talk about. Stephen Kinsella, the Taoiseach's new economic advisor. There's an interesting piece on him in businessplus.ie. It's based on a podcast he did on a podcast called The Entrepreneur Experiment, which I have never heard up to this point, but might be worth looking into.
Prof of economics down in UL, and well regarded.
One of those post-Keynesian types. Yeah, so we had been talking last week about some of the stats that had come out about the multinationals and how they indicated that Ireland was, while, on one hand, growing exceptionally strongly in these areas and making just fantastic sums of money, worryingly reliant on a very small amount of companies. And part of his conversation was about what would happen if the tech giants left. And the phrase used was, it would make austerity look like an episode of Care Bears. And I'll put a link to the podcast below. It's actually an interesting listen. There's a couple of stuff that's interesting. He gives a bit of what I've come to regard as the commonly accepted wisdom of Irish civil servants when he's talking about how a crisis like that could come together. And he says, well, it's the most obvious cause of this is going to be Donald Trump if he gets elected.
Yeah.
Part of that is because Donald Trump has said he wants to lower the US corporate tax rate to, I think, 13%. And he's talking a lot about US multinationals not paying American taxes, basically, and using other countries, Michael, who shall go unnamed.
Yeah, better.
Basically to handle their tax affairs in a way that is efficient, but perhaps not long for this world. I think when I talk to civil servants and politicians around it, this is a line I've heard quite a lot, that if Trump gets elected, this is what's going to happen. But then also a lot of, but we don't think he can actually force through his corporate tax rate. I think looking at what he did in his first term, it would actually be perfectly reasonable and prudent to assume he will. But also, I think it's this weird kind of thing where the underlying tone seems to be that the Republicans are the threat. Whereas in relation to American politics, even the Democratic politicians are very much getting into this place as well. Less so on the lowering corporate tax rates, but more on multinationals are not giving their fair share to America and we're going to do something about it. Particularly interesting in respect to that, Michael, I don't know if you've been following the Coca-Cola tax case.
No, I haven't. I didn't know there was such a thing. What's going on with the Coke? Big fan.
So the IRS brought a case against Coca-Cola and a US tax court judge ruled against them, I think, last week. Now, basically that has to do with how they are moving taxes around and what is owed to America. And the initial cost of that, Michael, to Coca-Cola is going to be $6 billion.
Oh, money. Real money.
Now,
wow.
Here's the thing. Yeah. Coke has to pay that money as they appeal. So they have to pay it, they have to appeal, and if they win, they'll get it back. But here's the interesting thing. Coke are saying that if the IRS thinks they're onto a winner here, and they apply that argument, the argument they're using here as to where Coke actually owes its taxes for its international business, if the IRS uses that for Coke's other years, Coke expects to owe upwards of $16 billion.
Well, if the IRS are anything like revenue, and I suspect they are in this regard, they will be coming for back payments, interests, and penalties. If they've got it for this year, why wouldn't they go back? If they owed it for X year, they owed it for all the other years too.
So the reason that this is going to be one of those really technical things that very few people care about, but it's actually deeply problematic to us because it all relates to what's called transfer pricing and how the IRS views it. Now, Michael, it might be good to realize that transfer pricing is very important to us because basically what it does on a practical sense is it affects how multinationals structure themselves and their subsidiaries and allocate their cost basis, and based on that cost basis, where their taxable, their profits are. And to be fair to the IRS, the multinationals have been perhaps not been entirely compliant with what the IRS would have done. And these transactions and transfers, which are often kind of designed for other reasons, have been used to shift profits from companies in which there's a very high tax into countries in which there's a very high tax, to countries which have a lower tax, which it might shock you, Michael, is often done using IP, things like that, licenses, intangible stuff that is very difficult to track and very difficult to quantify the cost of. And, that sort of stuff also doesn't really exist anywhere. So it's very easy to transfer it like that. So Ireland has been the beneficiary of ungodly amounts of that. And now it looks like the IRS are going, yeah, this wasn't designed to allow you to transfer to low-tax countries. So maybe we should have a look at that, and maybe we should start charging back tax on that.
Yeah, this is like connected, for example, both in tech but also pharmaceuticals. The licensing of intellectual property, patents, that kind of thing, and the transfer of ownership, or the charging between companies based here, and American companies, but which set up a notional headquarters here for certain kinds of IP, and then charging their sister company, shall we say, in the United States for the use of that. And now I'm just with the fact that it says 8 billion and 16 billion?
6 billion and 16 billion.
6 billion, 16 billion. Yeah, that sounds like you're not going back into perpetuity there. I'm wondering, Donald Trump introduced a tax reform bill in 2017, and the critics of the bill suggested that it might lead to this kind of offshoring. So it may be connected to that. As regards Donald's policy, the thing about it is, and I've heard people over here say, the reality is that he wants to come off with this big corporate tax cut, and with the kind of deficit that they're running, there's absolutely no way in the world that they can afford it, so it would never get through. Which I think misses the point both of the politics but also the economics. At this stage, when you consider the number and particularly the size of the American corporations that are not paying for really that much corporation tax in the United States, I think that Donald would probably make a fairly decent argument that there is a kind of a Laffer curve at operation here, Gary, that by reducing corporation tax down to say 15% or 13%, that the actual revenue generated will not actually represent a loss to the state, but could indeed produce extra revenues to the state by encouraging companies to come home and pay tax at home and repatriate their profits. So I'm not. That might or might not be true. I suspect that it might even be true. But the important thing is, I think he certainly could make a decent argument, a political argument, and cobble together a fairly decent economic argument that reducing corporate tax rates would not actually be a cost, but potentially be a Laffer curve style gain of the kind that Reagan had in the 80s, although some would say that Reagan was part of the problem of the increasing deficit, which may or may not be true. But by God, when you look at the deficit under Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and then you look at where it is now, it has grown like a monster in the last, say, 10, 20 years. It's kind of scary when you start looking at American deficits. But anyway, that is the threat to the Irish economy, and I think it's a real threat.
One thing to be kind of aware of here is that these cases take years, decades sometimes, to go through the courts. And on that basis, there's a kind of practical argument here of, okay, how many companies can they actually do this for? But then again, the outcomes can be so costly, particularly if the IRS decides to be quite aggressive with this. The concern, I think, is that you see a situation where a politician, be they Republican or Democrat, says, okay, we can do this manually, basically, and the IRS can do this, or we can do this in the following way, where if you accept some of this and give us a certain amount of back taxes and implement this moving forward, then it'll be more pleasant for you, but you do it now. And I think that's the real danger, because it's the impact of basically removing our competitive advantage. Well, it's a very odd competitive advantage, but it is one. By fixing this going forward, could potentially be extremely disruptive. I mean, these bonanza corporate tax payments would stop pretty much immediately.
Yeah. And the concern there is the degree to which they have been put into annualized spending. And I suspect more of than should have happened has been done. I thought, while his concerns are reasonable, Professor Kinsel's that is, where it all finishes up as reported anyway, on regarding the risks, all goes a little bit weird. Because he suddenly becomes worried about the far right, Gary. It's reported they said if far right politicians and parties gain a foothold in the next general election, it could risk destabilizing the relationship with global corporations based here. It's a very weird thing to say. We can't have that. Now, remember, this is happening in the context of a country where in the last election, in the middle of all of this brouhaha and all of the problems regarding migration and asylum seekers and the centres, all that stuff, and we had 4 or 5 county councillors elected who might reasonably be described as being from the hard right or the far right. 4 county councillors. I am not aware right now of any serious challenge to a seat in the Dáil. But imagine, Gary, that in the next Dáil there were 3 TDs, and I think that would be really surprising. If there were 3 TDs in the Dáil, this would cause the American multinationals to hitch up their skirts and run screaming, like some kind of Hanna-Barbera 1950s character running away from a mouse. Just, the language of the far right has already come into general political discourse here. That's a risk that could shatter Ireland's image as a place where it's pretty good to do business. Gary, these guys do business in China.
Yeah, I mean, that I think is an important point. It's unclear the mechanism through which he thinks this will happen. Now, Kinsella is a smart guy. I don't agree with a lot of his opinions, but he usually does have some intent and thought behind it. But you're right, Michael. Companies will very happily do business with some of the most awful countries in the world as long as they think there's money there. And so our politics going either far right or to the far left, up to the point it starts impacting on their actual financial interests, companies have shown, just historically, an incredible resilience to giving a shit.
If companies in Ireland were going to be worried about anything changing in the Irish political landscape, I would have said that 6 months ago to 12 months ago, they might have been concerned about the shape and the nature of a government led by Sinn Féin. That Sinn Féin possibly might have certain designs on the tax structure here, or interested in passing certain kinds of legislation that would negatively affect their bottom line. But Sinn Féin isn't the far right, and the far right is the thing that we want to make the bogeyman out of. And this just feels like somebody who's saying it feels like somebody who wants to see headlines like leading economist says far right represents threat to Irish economy. American multinationals could flee country if far right gain toehold, says leading economist. Leading economist warns against rise of far right and threat to jobs. These are all the headlines that I think people in government would very much like to see, and this kind of position will lead to. But it makes no sense to me. I mean, it's not like we're on in a situation, we're on the position where we're just about to see a coup being launched. But anyway, it's still useful the fact that he at least is waving some red flags about the state of the economy and the degree to which we have become ridiculously over-dependent as an economy on one particular source of tax revenue. And if that goes day bye-bye, as it did back in 2008, 2009, then we are going to be up the proverbial creek without the proverbial paddle.
Utterly unconnected to his work, and to bring the level of the discussion down, Michael, one thing I do actually like about him is that in every photo he ever appears in, he looks like he's either kind of a prick or just pissed off to be there. And I can respect that in a public-facing academic. There's too much of this look like you care and like these people.
And we won't name names here, there are those people whose hair is far too important.
You sometimes see academics smiling in public-facing photos now.
Academics didn't used to smile when I was in college. It was considered wrong.
So from Stephen Kinsel's sartorial or pictographical choices, I suppose, more exactly, England, Michael. England has had a couple of riots, a couple of zesty protests.
Mostly peaceful.
Mostly peaceful protests, yes. And they've taken a very different style of response to it than Ireland took after the Dublin riots. Although, interestingly enough, Michael, I do know that there's polling going on at the minute, by who I do not know, but I suspect Fine Gael, asking people would they support rapid judicial responses to to protests of this sort.
I suspect that in Ireland the answer will be much like the answer is in England. Yes, as long as everybody gets expedited at the same rate and with the same outcomes. And one of the problems in England is there is a perception in certain quarters, Gary, that not everybody is getting policed the same way, charged the same way, convicted and sentenced in the same way. And this is causing a degree of resentment. Actually, some of the sentences on the face of it, and listen, you're reading a newspaper report. You're not sitting in the court. You're not getting the full details. But if the details we're getting are pretty well what the story is, some of the sentencing seemed a bit weird and a bit over the top.
Aggressive, certainly. Extremely quickly delivered as well. I mean, just at incredible speed. Not that that's a bad thing. You know, they say, Michael, that justice delayed is justice denied, by which count we could probably have you in a prison in about a week. That must be the just option.
Yes, the just option. The problem is, I suppose, that it is in fact the speed which has made people feel uncomfortable or suspicious, because a system which is normally seen as being a little bit sclerotic. I mean, let's be fair. I mean, sclerotic, it's not French, it's not Italian, but it is not Usain Bolt in its approach normally to the execution of justice. Whereas this has been high speed, absolutely high speed. And, like, what was it, 5,000, 6,000 people have just been released from prison because of overcrowding. The new Minister for Prisons is coming in with a fairly explicit position regarding prison, where he has said in the lead up to the election that he thought that only around 1/3 of the people in prison should be there. And what was it, that men in prison weren't loved enough? Or am I misremembering that?
I can't recall in relation to that. Some of the sentences have been kind of bizarre to square against each other. Some of them are violence, but then the violence, someone got 3 years for punching a police officer in the face, and another guy who set a police van on fire got 2.5 years. Is assault considered more serious than setting a police van on fire? I don't know.
Well, assaulting a police officer would always have been considered to be more important than, say, assaulting a member of the public. It was always a serious thing to us. But again, in the context of the kind of sentence that we've seen historically in Ireland and in Britain, 3 years is is a long time. And by the way, I've noticed up to now anyway, it's not that we're talking about 3 years suspended in lots of cases. These are 3 years and off you go to Choki. There was a case of one guy who basically spoke disrespectfully using the word for God in Arabic. And my impression from having read it, and there may have been other details absolutely which I missed, but it seemed to be that basically he was behaving like a prick, Gary. There's absolutely no question about that. He was being insulting, and certainly you could say, although I don't know quite how Islamophobic behavior, whatever the word Islamophobia, and increasingly that is something I wonder what that word means substantially. But he was behaving in a kind of a racist way and disrespectful and nasty and provoking. But he got 8 months in Choki for that. Now, if they're going to start handed down sentences for being a prick or being stupid, Gary, then we're all in trouble.
On one hand, you have the people who are involved in the actual riots themselves, or were involved in theft from premises that were damages during the riots, looting effectively, violent disorder, those kind of people. Some of those cases are interesting. Like the guy who you mentioned who was shouting, "Who the fuck is Allah?" He got 2 years and 8 months, but part of that was because he had been throwing bottles and rocks at police. His, did you hear his reason for why he had rocks in his pockets?
No.
He said that they were for healing purposes.
No.
So you got to admire that.
But
the judge, by the way, did not agree with his view that the rocks were for healing purposes. Maybe he should have brought some nice crystals instead. But I think the sentences that people have been particularly interested in, more than the actual riot, like the on-the-ground physical guys, was the people who were sentenced for online activity.
Yeah.
Because in relation to the people who were at the riots, some people have said, that they're being investigated and they were just there, but they weren't getting involved. But that's always going to be a matter of back and forth. The police are going to say you were involved in certain things, and you're going to
but actually,
say you weren't.
Gary, sorry, just in one case in Belfast, the judge said you were there. There was no reason to believe, or there was no evidence that he'd been involved in the disorder, or that he had thrown stones or bottles, or he'd thrown a punch or assaulted anyone. He was just there to observe. However, simply by the fact that he was there to observe, he was a participant, and he ended up getting 6 or 8 months in prison sentence. So even in a case where they said he wasn't doing anything, or at least they had no reason or evidence to suggest that he was just there standing on the sideline. I would have thought that was a bit of worry for the citizen journalist these days.
So we have seen a range of sentences handed down in relation to people basically saying things online about the riots, ranging from, I think, at the lowest end, 3 months in prison, to at the upper end, 38 months in prison, 3 years, 2 months.
Yeah.
That was for, I believe the exact charge was for inciting racial hatred online. There were other ones who were, publishing online material intended to stir up racial hatred, sending false communications. I think there was one case as well of sending a communication threatening death or serious harm.
Yeah.
But kind of a spread. Also, there's some of these cases, Michael, when people say they've been threatened, and then when you actually see the message, it's someone saying, "I hope you die."
Yeah.
And I make the point, that's not a threat. That's a wish of ill upon you.
It's a prayer.
But not a threat.
Perhaps a prayer, but yes, it's not a threat.
Yeah, some of this were definitely threats. Some of it, though, and some of it was, you could argue, incitement for others to do things. Like one of the threats, or one of the messages was blow the mosque up with the adults in it. Don't protect the mosque. Which is not a threat, but you'd argue, I think, is pretty clearly incitement. But some of it just seems to be, I don't care about this, or I hope they're hurt.
Yes, Like there was the incident where talking about he talks about a particular kind of a violent action, and then says, "I don't care. Do this X Y Z. Do this action. I don't care." And when you actually read the sentence as it's written, what he's saying is, if people did this, it wouldn't bother me. This is obviously taking an example of what everybody in normal circumstances would regard as a terrible, terrible thing. And he's saying, listen, this thing, if you did this, I wouldn't care. Now, he was done for incitement. And on the plain English reading of the sentence, it is not an incitement because it's not a call to do something. It's a statement that his feelings, his resentment, his fed upness, whatever it is, has reached such a peak, such a point, that even if this happened, he wouldn't care. Now, you might regard that as reprehensible, as morally wicked, whatever. But people like to say, oh, that technically this, technically that. The law is a technical thing. Things are either legal or illegal. There's no such thing as technically illegal. It's legal or illegal. It is a technical subject. And it seems to me laws should respect what they are. So if you're trying somebody or charging somebody with an incitement, then the sentence should be an incitement. And as I like to say, on the list of the many things that I am not an English lawyer, but I speak the English language. And that sentence is not calling on people to do something. It was a statement about how this man felt. And whether you might regard what his feelings were as bad, wicked, reprehensible, wrong, whatever, but they were not an incitement. They were not a call to action.
Yeah, I think that was the guy convicted for 3 years. Now, I think half that is on license, suspended effectively. But yeah, that particular message, it was mass deportation now. Set fire to the fucking hotels full of the bastards for all I care. If that makes me racist, so be it. Which is not a threat to do so, and is not arguably not even incitement. It's a statement of view, which, as you said, not a pleasant view. But there were, they say, other tweets, other images. It was very clear when he was being sentenced that the judge said that when she was sentencing him, that it had to be seen in the wider context of the riots in the UK, given Michael his keen interest in current events.
Oh.
And basically said that the overall tone, is a direct quote, the overall tone of the posts identified clearly reveals your fundamentally racist mindset. It is an interesting approach to simply try and jail everyone who is racist. I don't think it will go very well.
I don't know if it does the judiciary or the legal system in the United Kingdom any great good. I mean, there was that example of the guy who was sentenced to 8 months, and at the end of it, the judge commented, "You are not in employment, but are, was it fit and healthy or something?" There's a tone in some of these commentaries and sentencings of classism, of condescension, of contempt, of, oh, we're going to teach you a lesson. And, as in the language of the old Catholic confessional, taking pleasure in it. And I don't think it's a good look. But then again, we are relying again on reports, so maybe it's not like that. But I don't think it's a good look. I don't think it helps. But I might have a look actually over the next little while over the sentencing policies in the UK, because to end up in prison, first offence, for doing something which was like this for a year and a half in Ireland, I don't know what you have to do. I mean, considering how hard many Irish criminals try to get into prison, and still it takes them a long time to get there, like a lot of convictions. I'm curious how consistent this is with historical sentencing. It may be, it may not be, I don't know. But I think I might have a look.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly worth looking into getting a greater sense. My sense is that these are quite significant sentences in relation to the sort of that would have been handed down traditionally in England and delivered very, very quickly. I think when you look at the ground level, Michael, you look at the violence, very few people are going to disagree with lengthy sentences for public violence. But when you start looking at some of these online offences and some of the things that seem to have led the sentences to have been increased beyond what they normally would, even in relation to the violence, I think there's a sort of stuff there that might be of concern, Michael, to a motivated civic liberties group, that might have some interest in perhaps not all of this is exactly how it should have been dealt with. Also, as I said, in a practical level, I doubt this will help, because a large part of the complaints we've seen in Britain is that there is a tiered policing and judicial response to different issues. And I'm not sure immediately coming out and starting to hand down multi-year sentences to the people who were involved is really going to do a lot to dissuade people against that. And I don't know if you've seen the polling, Michael, but a lot of the people polled don't agree with these riots, but a lot of them share their concerns. And if it actually reflects wider societal views, you may just be creating a problem for yourself.
Listen, I think there is at times with politicians a weird tone deafness. And I think, and it happens on the left and on the right and in the middle, depending on what you're talking about. On this kind of thing, the progressive left seems to be tone deaf to the fact that very often these kinds of resentments are not driven necessarily by racism or xenophobia or misogyny or whatever kind of hate thing. There will be a proportion of people who feel those things, but for many, many people, their resentment, their discontent derives from a perception of a lack of fairness. We have talked about this many times, Gary, and we talked about it in the United States when Trump won, when the analysis was done in the exit polling and a lot of polling after, when people went looking for the racists. They didn't find them, and we found, in fact, that there were counties that had voted substantially for Obama that went on to vote substantially for Trump, for example, which was suggestive that it wasn't that they wouldn't vote for, say, a black candidate or whatever, that they were deeply racist, but they felt it was unfair. Now, if that is something which is informing the problem, and let's see, that was from the commentaries one of the issues informing the problem. If you then go on and have what is perceived to be two types of reaction by the police towards one kind of riot and a different reaction to another kind of riot, a different reaction then in the judicial, the speed at which people are arrested and then processed is radically different from one kind of crime as to another kind of crime. All you're doing is storing up more and more trouble. You're just confirming in people's minds that the thing that they were worried about is in fact true. And just before we go, because we'll tie it up now, Gary, this is reflected, I think, I don't know, you talked about the polling. I have seen some of the polling, and I've also seen, say, the ratings for the leaders and for the political parties. The Labour Party is down to the low 30s now. It's what, a month in power? His personal ratings have dropped another 10 or 11%. I mean, normally this is the period of the honeymoon. Normally you're going to be doing nice things that people want. But it kind of, I think, underlines the reality that he has a huge majority, but he didn't get a huge vote. And even the vote that he got was, at least in part, not because people wanted to vote for him, but they were voting against the Tories. And if he keeps going in this direction, I think he may find that he has a huge majority in Parliament, but he may lose the country. But it's their country, so they can lose it if they want.
Also, a thing to recall here is that fixed term Parliament.
Yeah.
So Yeah, if you're going to be unpopular, now is the time to be unpopular. But I'm sure we will get back to that. I'm sure the Labour Party will find new ways to be unpopular. And we will be back next week. Although, as I said, maybe not for all of you. That sounded more ominous than I intended.
It was a little bit.
No, actually, sorry. It was exactly as ominous as I intended. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
All the best.